very small little things that I just want to highlight today, because last night it's kind of a couple hours in the evening, but today we're going all day. So if you'd like to get a cup of coffee later on when we have our break this afternoon, there are a number of places you can get a cup of coffee within a short distance from here. There's the Killam Library, which is just in sort of that direction, about 5 minutes away, where there's a second cup. There's a Tim Hortons in the Student Union building in the same area. And just up the Coburg Road here, the main street that you come into Kings off, there's the Coburg Coffee Shop, and they're open all day as well. So that's coffee. As far as lunch goes, we're going to be having a fairly long lunch break to give people a chance to get out and have lunch and come back. But there is lunch in Prince Hall, which is the cafeteria here at King's, and that's between 12 and 1, and I think it costs about $8 for an all-you-can-eat lunch. So that's sometimes the easiest way to get lunch here, and there's also any number of other places within a relatively short distance. For those of you who are watching on the live stream, just a reminder that you'll be able to put your questions to us on Twitter, and I think the hashtag and the handle for the Twitter account will be on the screen throughout the live stream, so you'll be able to put in your questions. Okay, well, that's enough for the preliminaries, and what I'd like to do at this point is invite my colleague Doug Kirkcaldy, who teaches radio and audio production here at the King School of Journalism, who will introduce our keynote speaker for this morning.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, I do. I'm a member of the faculty at King School of Journalism, but enough about me. When Fred spoke of the outstanding array of people that we have here today, Suzanne Reber is one of those people. She's the Director of Digital Media at the Center for Investigative Reporting in California. The center started in 1977. It's a multi-award winning operation that operates in all media on multi-platforms. The center says on its website, "Journalism that moves citizens to action is an essential pillar of democracy." It says it wants to tell stories that make a difference, and a look at its many awards will tell you it's done that and more. And Suzanne is going to tell us today about and talk to us today about storytelling. Among the stories that Suzanne has worked on at the center include Rape in the Fields, an investigative work in collaboration with the University of California at Berkeley. The investigation told of the sexual abuse and rape that many women, migrant farm workers face as they work to put food on our tables. The investigation resulted in print articles, radio stories, the PBS program Frontline, as well as the Spanish language network Univision. Then there was Rehab Racket. That was a year-long investigation with CNN that found that the rehabilitation system in California was rife with fraud. Before Suzanne went to the center, she spent 3 years at National Public Radio in the U.S. People at NPR give her credit for starting that network's investigative unit, a unit that also won several awards. There seems to be a pattern developing here. But before all of that happened was the first time I met Suzanne. We both worked for that well-known public broadcaster that serves this great land of ours. Suzanne and I were both young in those days at the CBC. Suzanne is still young. Don't know how she does it. Suzanne spent more than 20 years at the corporation. No mean feat, I can assure you. She started as a junior editor, as all of us did, and ended up as, guess what, heading the investigative unit. Suzanne graduated from the University of London with a degree in German and French language and literature. She also got a degree in journalism, by the way, from the City University in London. A longtime colleague and a friend, Suzanne Reber.
Well, thank you, Doug. If this is okay, I'm going to walk and talk a little bit, because it just feels a bit more like actually having a conversation. I keep seeing people I know. This is freaking me out. But we still need to actually start, so could you guys help me get that site up? So while we're getting my presentation ready, I just want to say thank you so much for actually inviting me back to Canada. I've been living in the U.S. now since 2010, but coming back and seeing so many colleagues in the audience, hello, Bob, Steve, and actually today I want to do a shout out as well for a contact and somebody I worked with on an investigation, Don Worm, who happens to be in town as well, and we met at the airport yesterday, so I think there's just something happening. And so it's very exciting for me to be actually talking to you guys about what matters to me most in my life, and I've pretty well dedicated my entire career to what I'm hoping will get you guys excited today. So when I was thinking about the question about, you know, why does it matter, investigative journalism? And I think if I was to ask any of you guys, why did you come to J School? What would you say? Anybody? What's up?
To give people information so they can create social change.
There you go, change. I mean, I think most people, if you really would have a beer with them, they would tell you, you know, I'm a journalist because I want to change the world. And that is basically why I got into it. I was one of those people, you know, I was 10 years old, you know, my parents took me to London, and I'm running around with the little notebook, taking notes of, the London Underground is very efficient, you know, stuff like that. I just think there's an important communication going on that is ongoing, whether it's through literature, you know, media, or journalism. It's all really about talking to each other about important things. So if you get together with your friend in the afternoon or in the evening to talk at the pub, you're probably going to say, you know, here's what happened to me today. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is not so much the investigative part, even though that's what I've done for many, many years, the digging it up, the FOIAs, all those things that you are learning about. I'm hoping we can have a conversation about how do you tell the story so that people care and that they get engaged in that conversation. And so one of the things we do at the center is really think a lot about not just telling the story, but also how to innovate and how to get people to pay attention so that this bit about investigative journalism still matters. Making it matter is your job, because what's the point of doing the story if nobody's going to pay attention? So, you know, back in the 80s, the internet looked a little like this. This is one of the first kind of aggregator type organizations. Started in the 80s, lasted a couple of years. AP and a bunch of other partners joined up. And what they tried to do is what we're now seeing happening more and more. They tried to share a bunch of stories and get it out. It looks pretty basic now, but at the time it was like pretty innovative. And then, you know, in the 90s we move on to this, which you probably, I'm not sure how many of you guys get your news from sites like this, but the Drudge Report, which again, very simple interface, idea of getting as much in front of you as possible, hasn't really changed much since the 90s. And it's this idea of all news all the time, and it's the fragmentation of the story. Look at this site. So, I mean, you couldn't get any more busy, you couldn't get any more diverse, and that is what you're dealing with. If you are working your off for a year to do an investigation and you think you found some stuff, you have to get it out in this environment. You know, BuzzFeed. I don't know how many of you share BuzzFeed stuff. I know my kids send me BuzzFeed stuff. So, you know, BuzzFeed, definitely populist site. At the heart of it is you know, aggregation. On the other hand, though, this morning I went and checked just to see, and they're still breaking stories. So when it comes to investigative news, even BuzzFeed knows the value of it. In fact, they just started an investigative unit, and they just scooped an editor from ProPublica, which is another nonprofit investigative newsroom in the US that is kind of competing with Center for Investigative Reporting. And so they hired this editor to start an investigative unit at BuzzFeed. So I think it's telling you something that investigative journalism actually is a differentiator. But when it really comes down to this is your competition, okay? Grumpy cats, cat videos, dog videos. That's really what you have to think about. If people are going over their morning coffee to figure out what Grumpy Cat is doing today, how do you, after you've spent, months and sometimes years digging up stories that actually matter, you got to think about Grumpy Cat. And, whether it's the big websites that are getting all those clicks, like the BuzzFeeds, or even the hallowed New York Times, everybody's trying to figure out how to make it matter. How do I get your attention? How do I actually fit all of the work I've done, which now is mostly multi-platform. People are getting video. You have to learn how to work audio. You're thinking about the characters in your stories from all types of different points of view, whether it's text, audio, or video. So now, how do you present things to really get people's attention? This thing, I don't know if you studied it or talked about it in your class, snowfall blew everybody away. This happened last year. Have you seen it? Is anybody, is it very familiar here? I'd like to maybe just show you a little bit about what makes this so special. So this was one of those presentations where people just, when we saw this at the center, we went, oh my God, everything's just changed. Because what this presentation did is combine the idea of a completely coded, interactive, super complicated presentation with the GIF at the front, a long form story that is beautiful on the iPad and that you can roll through. And essentially all the video is embedded, the sound is embedded, and this idea of nobody does long form anymore, nobody will read it, it's clearly not true. If you have a presentation that you can grab people with. So I'm showing you this because, in the world of the center, where I'm working now, this is an organization that, as Doug mentioned, started in the 70s. And the idea was, it was actually started by Lowell Bergman. I don't know, do you guys know who he is? Yeah, Lowell Bergman is kind of one of these stars of investigative journalism, became very famous because he was actually the journalist that was at the heart of a movie that later was made about his story on the tobacco industry that really exposed how the tobacco industry had lied about how addictive smoking was. And they had gone for many years to Congress, and they'd always been asked the same question in these congressional sessions, like, is smoking addictive? And all of the heads of the various tobacco companies always said the same thing, no, it's not. And the movie The Insider was really about that investigation that was done for 60 Minutes, that Lowell Bergman, at the time producer for 60 Minutes, exposed how they had actually colluded for this big lie. So anyway, Lowell has been on the West Coast his whole life, and he is sort of one of these investigative reporters who is at the top of his field. So he started the center because he felt that independent investigative journalism was never going to be popular. And in fact, if you wanted to cement it, you needed to have it be entirely independent of networks. And so even though he worked on the West Coast, started the center, he would then produce his stories and collaborate with the 60 Minutes of the world. And now he's a correspondent for Frontline. And that was the ethos behind the center. And to this day, and it was the first one of its kind, the first nonprofit investigative newsroom in the US. And I think, frankly, probably at that point in the world. So he basically had this idea, and it's lasted to this day. So we went from the center, I think 5 years ago, was 7 people, and now it's 75 people. And that's because a lot of our funders were funded by foundations, individual donors who believe in the same concept today, that to preserve investigative journalism, you have to have independence. And the independence is one of the reasons I'm there now, because it gives us a chance to innovate and come up with new ways to tell a story. So when we see something like this, we freak out, because suddenly we go, oh no, it's changing again. We've got to figure out new ways to grab attention, because you got the New York Times with all their resources blowing it out of the park with new ways of telling a story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we respond, or what is it that makes us tick at a place like the center. So I'm going to go back to our presentation. Thank you. So, I mean, I'm hoping that you'll be able to go later and check out some of these things yourself and really engage with the content, because it's very cool. This was another example of the New York Times taking a long-form story where there's a lot of overlap here in the kinds of thinking and the kinds of discussions that we have in our newsroom about how to engage people. This was a long-form story about a guy who essentially died in this shady business of the fighters who fight in sort of in the illegal fighting world. And what they did is they engaged you with let me see, how's this going to work? Oh yeah, engaged you with graphics. So as you see, you can, as you're moving through the content, it's actually a flat graphic, but it's embedded in an interactive. So again, they're really playing around with this idea of trying to engage you on whatever platform you're working on, whether it's a mobile, whether it's an iPad. Everybody's trying to get your attention where you are now engaging with the content, which is likely to be some kind of mobile device. So I'm just going to quickly ask you guys, can you let me know, did anybody here read a newspaper today? Okay, we got 4 old guys. Okay, who woke up with their iPhone? And what's the first thing you clicked on this morning? 2 examples maybe. When you wake up with your iPhone, what do you do? Check the news? How do you check the news? Where do you go?
News apps.
Okay, what's your news app of choice? Wow, very impressive. So you are going to what is a legacy media site, but you're going through your app. And I'd say that's actually probably the most common thing. You can't get on a plane anymore where there isn't somebody who's got the iPad, plus the MacBook Air, plus the iPhone. And they're probably even doing all of it at once. And really, at the end of the day, this is what I'm trying to talk to you guys about. You have to think about this stuff when you're thinking about your story. And hopefully, in your collaborative teams that you have at your school, if you can have conversations about how to tell the story from the beginning, who's the audience, who are we trying to reach, I think you're going to have a lot more fun and success getting your story out there. So I'm going to move on a little bit to what the center does in this environment, which, as you can tell, it's innovative, it's exciting, but it's also super scary because you have to keep up with this kind of stuff. So when I joined the center, is everything good? Okay, sorry. All right, thank you very much. So I joined this, I started the NPR investigative unit in 2010. So that was an amazing adventure, getting recruited to go to the US and start something entirely new after having spent more than 20 years at CBC, working with some of the people in the room on investigative stuff and trying to, ruffle some feathers, get some attention. And we did do that. And I think one of the reasons why I ended up at NPR was because of the kind of innovation that we had done at CBC, especially on collaborative teamwork, working with CP on some of our investigations, working with the Toronto Star, trying to blow up this idea that it's all about the competition. What I was always about was, no, it's about the story. And how are we going to get the story out? And how are we actually going to do the story in an environment where every year at CBC we'd be cut? Like one day it's your pinky, the next day it's something else. So my response to that at CBC was collaboration. It was pragmatism. It was basically saying, I still want to do this work. There are people in this organization who care about it. How can we get it done? And not, give up. And the way to do that was to team up. And that eventually actually is how I ended up being recruited by NPR, because they wanted to start a team, and they wanted it from the get-go to break news fast. They wanted a story like within, a few weeks. As it turned out, we did that. Within the first 6 weeks, we had broken stories at NPR because I reached out to partners from the beginning, said, hey, you guys are doing investigative work. We want to work with you. So we worked with the Center for Public Integrity on a campus rape investigation. We worked with ProPublica on injuries among soldiers and brain injuries in all of the IED explosions. And so that is how work was done at NPR. We also did work with CIR. At the time when I was still at NPR, they were doing this thing called On Shaky Ground. It was a massive investigation of earthquake safety among schools. And they had all this data, which took them 18 months to crunch, on basically how money was being spent to update the safety of schools, or it was supposed to be spent on updating the schools. And of course, it didn't get spent that way because it ended up as a slush fund for a bunch of other projects in the California school system. So when the center was dealing with On Shaky Ground, I think this was one of the first times when they really discussed in their groups, how do we grab people's attention? This is an issue of public safety. People want to know, how do we actually get beyond the long-form story of, say, your 5,000 word, aren't we great investigative story, look at what we did. It's not enough, because the average person, as you just pointed out, is not going to read that in the LA Times. They're going to try and find it some other way. So they designed an app, and still to this day, you can type in your zip code, and it will tell you if your school or where you live is on the kind of ground that is going to liquefy if there's an earthquake. This kind of term actually freaks me out because I'm living over there now. And so I checked that out. The first time I moved there, I looked where my neighborhood was, and I tried to get a house on a rock that wouldn't liquefy. They also decided who else cares about this idea of safety in schools and what would happen if there was an earthquake. And of course there frequently are in California, even though most of them are moderate. That would be the kids. And so what happened inside the sort of collaborative melting pot of CIR is that people in the engagement unit got together with the people who were doing the journalism, and they said, you know what, we need to reach kids. How are we going to do that? So they actually collaborated with the Red Cross and other nonprofits, and they did a coloring book. And at the beginning, I think they printed, about 10,000. And since then, they had to reprint them. They've been published in multiple languages, Spanish and Vietnamese. And then even I think it was last year, we had the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake. And they went back and did public events with the Red Cross. And this little coloring book thing is informed entirely by the investigative work. So every finding that came out of that 18-month investigation is at the heart of this coloring book. So even though it's a funky little character, the information in there is based on the investigative work. This is a little bit of the detail from the coloring book. So this is kind of the environment that I entered as I got to CIR. So since then, move forward a couple of years, we're now doing a lot of stuff on food safety and this incredible overload of sugar and salt in our food today and how that affects especially kids. So we actually just a month ago launched our first ever video game. We teamed up with IGN, which is a video game developer. And again, these are relationships that are based on one principle. We care about the story. Can we work with you to get it out? And so, in fact, we got a grant, a $10,000 grant, to make the video game. And it took a year, and it's entirely informed by all of the data crunching we've done with the food ingredients, the levels of salt, and we created these characters. And as you go through, the kids, it's built for kids who are in the ages of sort of 10 to 12, and they can engage. And as they put food on the idea is it's called Hairnet Hero because the lunch ladies at the schools wear the hairnets. So and they're always trying to get you to eat good food, and the kids, frequently don't want to eat the good food. They want to eat the pizza and that kind of thing. So we tried to play off this idea of how do we get kids to understand this data that we have on what is actually going on their plate. So you deconstruct that and you come up with different ways. So you can, in the game, which I don't want to show you because it's very large to load, but you can go back and check it out. So again, we're taking investigative findings that took a long time to develop and just trying to find a different way to engage the audience in that material. And in this case, who's the audience? It's the kids, because they're the ones who are eating the school lunches. So you can write your wonderful school lunch piece and maybe want to get it published in the New York Times or some other place, and that's going to make the journalists feel really good. But the people who need the information are not necessarily going to get it. So this is one of the reasons we have very long story meetings. And they're long because they tend to try and figure out what should we do here? And you have to set yourself in motion because of course then developing it could take some time. But we felt like from the beginning we wanted to engage with the kids, and this was a way to do it. We only just launched it last month, so I'm not really sure what's going to happen, but now when we go into the community, we can take it with us, we can engage the kids, we can have conversations with an audience that generally doesn't speak with investigative reporters. And as you drag your food on, depending on how much salt or sugar is in your food, there would be a lot of salt in that piece of pizza, the little monsters that you saw before will grow bigger and start making crazy noises, so the kids can actually see the effect as they're putting it on. The other thing we've done a lot this past, actually almost 2 years now, is we have done a lot of reporting on veterans. I mean, the U.S. has now been at war since shortly after 9/11, and this is a massive community of vets that's coming out of these two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. So we've done, obviously, the traditional investigative reporting. We apply for, we have FOIAs going all the time. We have sources. We're constantly breaking stories in that field of the vets. And I'm not showing you the traditional stories where they show up. They show up on NewsHour. They show up on some of the feeds that you're talking about. We do stuff with the Daily Beast, Huffington Post. We try and get our story out wherever we can get it. I'm really not showing you those stories today, but we're doing those all the time. When it comes to the vets, the two biggest stories we've worked on this past 18 months or so are the wait times of the vets who sometimes wait 2 years to get their disability claims handled. So this has been a big deal, and now the backlog, as it's called, is part of the sort of president's vocabulary. That wasn't there before because we made that conversation happen. But now we're also trying to talk to the vets directly and engage with them, not just on telling us, what's wrong with the system, but how are you handling your life and how are you dealing with things? So we actually teamed up with a radio station to sort of do a call out for vets who are writing music, because we found out through YouTube, believe it or not, that a lot of vets are constantly self-publishing their music. And we wanted to see what would happen if we actually engage with the vets on that level directly. So this is another experiment that is just ongoing right now. We haven't yet published some of the music, but I want to just see what happens. I want to show this to you as a way to engage directly with the community that's involved in your investigation. Another thing we did with our vet coverage is we felt that a lot of times with investigative reporting, it's unless you work hard to engage directly with the audience, it can be like watching TV. It's very much that you're not necessarily engaged in the action. The action's kind of being, you're being bombarded with images and messages, but how are you actually interacting with that emotionally? So we did this collaboration with a theater company in San Francisco called Tides Theater. And we said, look, we've got all these findings, and you guys are always looking for news stories. What if we teamed up and you guys worked with us and our findings, and let's see what happens. So we actually had called out again, like we did with the musicians, we called out to playwrights in the San Francisco Bay Area, independent playwrights, and we said, let's sit down and we're going to talk to you about the stuff we're finding out about vets. So one of the things we found out about vets was that there's a lot of homeless female vets. In fact, it's the largest growing community of vets in the U.S. If you look at them as a group, their numbers are growing larger than other groups, and they're largely underground. They are very hard to pinpoint. They don't tend to take services, and they a lot of times end up homeless on the streets, especially in LA. So we had done an investigation and a film about this community. And so in the end, one of the plays that came out of it had to do with a character that was a compilation character from some of our findings that you see here with this woman who essentially is having sort of a psychotic episode because she believes she's still in Iraq when she actually is living homeless on the streets. So when we presented that play, and another one based on another investigation we did, which has been an award-winning investigation looking at the developmental centers of California. So these are the centers that are state-run, that are housing some of the most developmentally challenged people who sometimes end up living there for decades because there's nowhere else for them to live. What Ryan Gabrielson, one of our reporters, uncovered is that in these centers, these patients or these people living there were routinely abused. Sometimes they were tasered, they were dying, they were being raped, and it was completely underground, even though they had this police force that had been especially charged with this idea that they should protect this community. And instead, they were not investigating, covering it up. And so this investigation that we did called Broken Shield, which has now been going on for almost 2 years, is another subject matter that we discussed with Tides Theater. And in the end, the playwrights picked these two themes as to them some of the most interesting. And they ended up writing, the play up there is one of the characters in our investigation was a guy called Van Ingram, who Ryan focused on because he ended up basically having his neck broken by one of his caregivers, and Ryan investigated this cover-up. And in the end, Van Ingram died of his injuries, and it was our investigation that uncovered how that all happened. So that's basically an interesting phenomenon taking place on stage. So what happened when we actually presented these plays live is that Van Ingram's brother, Larry, who had been a cop himself, who was very frustrated with this idea that as an investigator, he should have been able to find out what happened to his brother. But it wasn't until he teamed up with an investigative journalist, Ryan, that he was able to find out what actually happened. So there's this very cathartic situation. So when the play was presented, Larry Ingram, this character, this cop, came to watch the play. Now you can imagine what it's like for us. We're the journalists who've just exposed ourselves, if you like, with our investigations, and now this play. What is he going to say? How is he going to react? And so there was this very cool moment when he came on the stage at the end to have a conversation with Ryan, the journalist, in front of the audience about what it meant to him to team up on the investigation and actually see something happen, real change happen in California because of that investigation. But he didn't really get his brother back until that day when he was on that stage or watching that stage, because he felt what you guys did is you brought my brother back, and he was alive there, and it was done in such a realistic way that I feel like he got a voice. So this is kind of complicated stuff, right? But when we talk about doing investigative journalism and saying we want to give voice to the voiceless, how many times have you heard that phrase? That's one of those investigative phrases that we like to tell each other, right? And it's true. That's what we do. We give voice to the voiceless. We talk about subjects that a lot of times the media glosses over or doesn't have time to investigate, and we spend months, sometimes years, trying to figure out what happened and to give voice to the voiceless, which is what we did with Neil Stonechild, who had been murdered by the police who dragged him into a cop car and never let him out and dropped him off at the edge of town like human garbage. He did not have a voice until the investigation kind of brought back what had happened to him. The same with Van Ingram and Larry. We brought that character back to life. So, I mean, this may not make you feel very comfortable. Is it traditional journalism? Is it what we're supposed to do? And I guess my answer to that would be, well, who says we can't do that? What is wrong with the crossover as long as the information is entirely accurate? And so when it came to the characters in the Larry and Van Ingram story, our journalist read the script and signed off on whether he was comfortable with that. And in the end, we also got validation from one of the main characters in the whole investigation, which was Larry, who was incredibly moved when he saw this story come to life on the stage. So it's just a different way to experience the exact same findings. And I know that some of this is challenging the idea of what is traditional journalism, what is actual communication with the audience. But this is the sort of stuff we're trying, and I can just tell you that having sat there in that audience, there's definitely something pretty chilling going on when you see it come to life. So whether it's a dramatization in a film, which sometimes happens in documentary, whether it's a film like The Insider, which was based on investigation and became a Hollywood film, those are the ways that the audience to date, whether they're young people or older people, are interacting with the material. So I think we have no choice but to think about this stuff. And in some cases, it's places like ours that are maybe getting other media to feel a little more comfortable with this idea. I don't know, maybe it would be time to actually just let you see a little bit of the video, and you can hear a bit more about Storyworks, which is the brand that we picked for this collaboration.
I'm Jennifer Welch. I'm the producing artistic director for Tides Theater and the producer of Storyworks, which is a collaboration between Tides Theater and the Center for Investigative Reporting. From the 13 investigative reports that CIR was working on, I then developed an outline of how we could take a number of those pieces and develop them into theater productions.
So we're starting with the anchor on the top. So we're not starting with this line, but Sally, the page has been a doctor my whole life. Good.
I'm saving my soul here. Yours is out of reach. I can't forgive you because that's not a forgivable thing.
We take in the news in a very personal, it's a very private endeavor. And you may talk about current events and you get into political discussions all the time, and everyone has a point of view, but to experience it together as a community, I think is something that's really special about this project.
Right, so as you can see, that character, the soldier, what she was talking about is having been raped by her superior. And military sexual trauma is actually one of the reasons a lot of these female vets end up on the streets, because they, A, deal with the trauma of the rape, and then often they're drummed out of the military because either they report it or they have the consequences, which can involve, episodes like PTSD, and so they often are, they're not even in the military anymore because they get dumped. So, what's going on here? Can't seem to move. Hang on, guys. I don't know, this is one of these things where I'm not really sure how much of the collaboration, how we move in the community you guys can handle, but another project that that I lead, which actually started right about the time that I came to the center, is another community that we frequently, with journalists, find really hard to engage is young people. And we're talking about kids in high school who will not engage at all with traditional media. That is just not what they do. And so again, if your idea is investigative reporting, how do we engage that particular community? You have to step outside of legacy media. You can't have conversations with that community, which is a huge issue, because if you're trying to engage these kids with the idea that journalism matters, and especially investigative journalism, which is super time intensive, incredibly expensive to do, and tends to highlight very important issues in society that you're wanting to have a conversation about, then talking to youth, how do you do that? So again, we kind of got together, brainstormed with an organization that started in San Francisco called Youth Speaks. And what Youth Speaks is all about is slam poetry. Do you guys know what that is? It's a big movement. I know that in Toronto and other places in Canada, they have massive slam festivals. So Brave New Voices, what they do is they do workshops with high school kids, and they try and get them to write about their lives. And most of the students engage on this level. It's basically about coming out, or it's about their first love affair, or it's getting dumped. Those are three massive themes in slam poetry. And so what we thought about is, what if we found a way to engage with this community and actually talk to them about real journalism and findings? So we designed some workshops. We hired a guy on a grant that was one of the kind of stars of the movement. And what these kids do is they age out at 18. So at 18, in the Brave New Voices world, you're considered old. So at that point, a lot of the Brave New Voices kids who are really good, they become educators in the arts environment. Some of them become teachers. And in our case, Josh Merchant was the guy that we hired to engage with the poets and design a different workshop that was entirely informed by findings. So we had done an investigation on a community called Stockton. Have you ever heard of Stockton, California? It was the first place in the US to go entirely bankrupt as a result of the crash of 2009 and all the things that happened. Stockton was the first community to file for bankruptcy. So we thought this was a really interesting place to go and poke around. And so we spent a long time in Stockton finding out what happened there. And what we found was that they had been sold a bill of goods on many levels, and that they had bought bonds they couldn't afford, so that by the end of it, they were paying the kind of interest that would be usury in a lot of cases. And it was in part because they were sold these bonds because they were running into financial trouble. So this is one of our poets that we worked with, Corey. And Corey's a guy who lives in a garage. Stockton is definitely poor. He was smoking up a lot, and he basically kind of got coaxed into the workshop. He kind of thought, yeah, I'll give it a shot, let's see how it goes. And he ended up becoming not only a star of the whole thing, but he ended up getting to the National Slam Finals, which were in Chicago this August. And his poetry that he wrote in this workshop was about Stockton. And I bet you there's no way he would have been talking in any of his poetry about bankruptcy and his environment if we hadn't interacted in that way. And so something definitely happened with him. I'm just going to give you a little taste of that.
This is our second event here for the Off-Page Project, which is a collaboration between the Center for Investigative Reporting and You Speaks. What are the stories that are being underreported in our communities and our daily lives? And how is storytelling, in addition to theater and the arts in general, a pathway towards social change?
Town. It's dangerous up in here. The murder rate is a murder race in here. 68 deaths and still counting. So I'll chase my drink of beer.
In 1999, Stockton had nearly $14 million in savings. Now you're one of 31 cities that tastes like bankruptcy. You're not just broke physically, you're literally broke.
I come from a long time career in newspapers, and I ran newspapers. I did everything you can do in a newspaper. And I think we're at a moment where you really have to try and experiment.
Seeing all the statistics and seeing how screwed Stockton really was, I started noticing how bad it really is. Before I did this, I was dropping out of high school. The fact that we're artists coming out of the crappiest place in the world, that's gonna bring kids out of neighborhoods where they think that art isn't big,
And if we can tell a story that a 15-year-old kid would never read in a long-form text story, but we can do some form of a slam or a poem that gets them motivated or engaged or teaches them something, then we'll have achieved something.
So I just want to make sure I'm not rushing through everything. Are there any questions? Because we're moving through a lot of kind of stuff that might seem a little weird to you guys. I don't know.
Sam, what will tell you if this is successful? Rosenthal just alluded to it there, but I'm just wondering, these are different ways to present your findings, to present your research. In the old days, if it was in the New York Times, it might move to legislation and a change. What will tell you that these projects are successful?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think tracking the impact of this kind of stuff is a job in itself. And so, I mean, I totally realize I'm very fortunate to be working at the center, which, as I said, has 75 people, some of whom are there. We have 4 or 5 people doing just engagement and analytics. And so they're doing all the social media. They are constantly putting stuff out there. In the case of Off-Page, which really, I mean, honestly, we just started this last October. So that's 1 year. So in the first year, we've done a couple of things. Design the methodology. So that is now being shared with educators around the country. So as a workshop, it's a slightly different format. So you have to actually track, how the methodology is working. We did a beta test in Stockton with, we had 6 kids. In fact, there were 8, but some of them drop out because it's Stockton. Very challenging place. We had one student who, was incarcerated for part of the time. We had another student whose mother is, living on the streets, is drug addicted. Very challenging environment in Stockton. But of those kids, 2 of them, so you got 6 kids, 2 of them ended up making sort of the level of what would be considered the national slam. So they ended up going to the nationals. And so what happened because of that is when we went to Chicago as part of the nationals, we used our kind of methodology, and we did town halls with all of the kids at the Brave New Voices Festival. So I can only gauge it by the response that we're getting from the kids. They're incredibly animated about it because it's entirely multimedia. So not only did we do the poem, but we did something called taking it off the stage. Because a lot of times slam poetry is entirely it's a one moment in time thing. People perform it and it's gone. What we said is you need to harness what you're doing. You need to make this a story. And so we have obviously done video and I think we've engaged those kids in something that they haven't done before. I would say that we changed the course of that organization. Now, whether or not we can engage beyond that on a network level, because we're now trying to get our sort of beta test out to other locations, that's the next step, is to see, can we actually get more, so we're trying to sort of get more cities to try the same thing, using researched journalism material for the writing workshops as opposed to just point of view. That's a change. It's already happening. Now, is that enough? I mean, I'm not sure. But the way that we're seeing it, we've engaged a community that didn't think about journalism a year ago. So that's where we're at. I mean, I don't know yet, totally. But you know, that's the question, right? How can you keep the conversation going? Wait. So, actually, I'm going to show you one more film. Sorry, do I need? Oh, okay, right. Any more questions before I move on? Do you want to?
Is it hard to get organizations like Youth Speak on board with what you're doing? Like, is it hard to convince them, or are they usually pretty on board with everything?
You know what, that's a great question too. I think there's something about the center that has a lot of energy. There's a lot of passionate people there. And I have found that if you approach people and say, hey, we want to try something, and you come at them in a very sort of open-ended way, and then you design together what you're going to do, our experience is that almost everybody that we approach says, hey, this is exciting, because it's not a world they're in. And our experience has been, it's been generally very positive. Our challenge is more, how many partners can you juggle? That's actually our challenge. It's not that we don't want to have partners, it's like, do we have too many? Is this an effective partnership? So for us, it's got to be two things. It's got to be always pushing our boundaries. So why did we do Youth Speaks and Off Page, which is, you know, the brand? Because it was reaching a brand new community that we had never engaged with before on this level. It was a true integration. It wasn't just us stepping in front of these kids and saying, hey, aren't we great? We're journalists. We're going to tell you something. That's not the conversation they want to be having, because that's a very top-down conversation. So this is taking a risk, because you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, in fact, there was an experiment with Youth Speaks a couple of years ago. I think it was HBO. HBO did a show with Youth Speaks because they thought, oh, this is really cool. You know, poetry, young people, makes great TV. Let's, you know, engage with these kids. But what they ended up doing is they made a reality TV show, and you know what those are like. You watch The Hills, or, you know, or, I don't know, Gossip Girl or something like that. I have two girls, so I've watched that stuff. But it's all about the tension, and it's all about the drama. And so what they ended up doing to these kids is they made a film about them, not with them. And they hated it. And in fact, there was a rebellion at the Grand Slam when, at the end of the slam, the kids, you know, they celebrate each other because they've just been up there. And they do a lot of sort of like, they run up to each other and high five and hug and do all that kind of stuff. And the HBO producers were taken aback by this, you know, very effusive sort of display of affection. And they asked the kids to do it again. So you can imagine. So that's the producers trying to make a thing and not think about the kids. So these kids just went crazy, and refused, and then there was a scene about this, and they were just upset. So when we first talked to Youth Speaks, that's actually what we had to avoid, because we needed to get their trust. So I think it's a different conversation. Steve? Is there another microphone up there?
I don't think you really need one.
Speak loudly.
If you're lucky enough to have a boss like you who has an open mind, this is a great idea. But in this day and age where everything we're doing more and more, we're filing for the web, we're filing for TV, radio, I have no clue what people in newspapers do anymore anyway. But I mean, they do the same thing, they file for the web. How do you convince, like getting people one-sided poets and the young people, I don't think it's even an issue. It's simple. But getting the monkeys, the higher-ups up, to even, if I even went to Fred, my boss, and said, hey, look, I've got this great idea. We just did this whole thing about youth in prison. Let's get some slam poetry. He'd say, are you insane? Take a fucking week off, you moron. I mean, really, you would. How do you engage like the networks, the ones that will actually take this to a level that your eyes will sparkle?
I think at the end of the day, it's about programmers. So I think inside a news organization, what I would do is I would engage programmers who do see the value of making a program about something that hasn't been made. So I think if I were, trying to go back to my sort of CBC days, it's definitely a harder argument to make to do news in this way. On the other hand, though, I lived in Toronto, so my background was, my radio station was Metro Morning. They would. Susan Margetti, I don't know if she's still in charge of that, but she used to, every year when the slams would come to Toronto, I know that they put the slam poets on. I know they did. So I think it's speaking to the programmers about the value of something different and looking at it from the point of view of maybe the programming opportunity that is an intersection with the journalism. I think we tend to come at it from the point of view of, how do we do journalism? And our journalistic bosses might say, that's whacked, I'm not doing that. But the programmers might be open to it. So that's probably the approach I would use. If I was at CBC now saying, hey, we did this thing, I know it works, hear me out, go to the website, show them. It's actually engaging a community that I know CBC programmers, whether they're radio or TV people, want to be seen to be engaging youth. Because it's probably one of their kind of criteria of, excellence criteria, right? So, it's not easy. I'm not saying it is, but it's been done. And if HBO can try and make a show about slam poetry, which they kind of screwed up, but they saw the value of it, then now I would say there's some breadcrumbs to follow of what could work, even in an environment like CBC. And I think actually it could work. So go for it. We can collaborate. So the other thing we're doing with the Youth Speaks experiment is we're actually making a film. And we are trying, for the first time, to really take it kind of to the feature film level. When I say feature film, I'm not talking 90 minutes, but certainly between 30 to an hour. And we're right now in conversations with producers. So this is our trailer for what we're calling Good Kid, Broken City, is going to be our film about these characters and what happened to them during the year that we worked with them.
Stockton is located on a navigable river, a key city in the Central Valley for marketing and distributing fresh vegetables and fruit.
Stockton, California is so broke, even Lindsay Lohan refuses to shoplift there.
There are about 70 or so documented gangs in Stockton.
We've had the highest foreclosure rate in the nation.
Downtown was the heart of Stockton.
Do you think it'll come back?
No, never.
Didn't we get ranked like one of the worst places on earth? Yeah, we did.
Do you feel like you'll be successful in Stockton? Damn no!
I go to a school that most people know as the bad kids school.
Credit issues, suspensions, and expulsions.
Guns, gangs, getting locked up, misdemeanors.
These kids don't lead Disney lives.
The abandonment of my parents only turns after not almost killing. Poetry, a way to express myself without violence, really.
There's a whole culture of Stockton that hasn't even really been explored. I have a lot of data about Stockton.
It will cost the city $1 million a year over 30 years to pay back the $10.9 million it rated for the arena complex.
I never even knew that.
That's astonishing. What would happen if we combine poetry with investigative journalism?
Stockton, it's dangerous up in here. The murder rate is a murder rate in here. 71 deaths and still counting.
Look at facts but try to put it in a poetic way.
You're one of 31 filed for bankruptcy. The banks have corrupted your credit. See,
Most people feel like young people is like naive.
I'm not as nervous as I used to be, but still, getting up in front of just my class, like, it makes my adrenaline rush.
Do you know why and how they passed away?
They drowned in a Levy River. This isn't fun. You gotta read, you gotta write. There's critical thinking.
Not all of them can show up to the workshop. One of the students got incarcerated.
This art form, while it is open, everybody can't walk through that door.
Poetry's like made me a completely different person.
I'm gonna go to college.
Just give a more realistic story as to what's happening with Stockton. Ain't nobody gonna tell their stories but them.
Your 2013 Stockton National Slam Team.
Yeah, so it's definitely cool. I think, I was thinking back to talking to Dawn about our work in Saskatoon. I mean, Stockton is that kind of place where a lot of kids are going to just get thrown in the gutter. So back to your question, how much change do you have to have in order to feel like your journalism is meaningful? This is just me. Like, I'm just a person who spent like my career working on journalism. This matters to me because that's actual stuff happening. That's not just somebody writing about your story or quoting you. That's kids. I mean, in other words, is it enough for me that Corey is probably going to be going to university? And he sure as hell wasn't before. So, it's social change, and it's happening because they interacted with some of the most boring data you have ever seen. I would be like challenging most journalists to write about bankruptcy. That is hard stuff. I mean, I was in charge of the reporter who did the investigation. Her first film, which is about Stockton and the bankruptcy, aired on TYT. Do you guys know TYT? It's called The Young Turks. It's the biggest online news cast in the world. They have like 1 billion views or something. They're entirely online. They do not have an over-the-air broadcast. And they are huge among youth, 18 to 25, and actually, I think over to 35. So when we did the film about Stockton, we did it for them. So the first film, so I was in charge of the journalist that did this investigation. And she had that painful look. That pain when you look at the PDFs of yet another financial report. And I don't know that stuff. I'm not the math geek. I know nothing. I just know that there was some really bad fraud that happened there. And it took us a year. Okay, a little less than a year. The whole project took a year, but the investigation probably took 6 months to get to the bottom of who did what in the Stockton place. So all those findings went to that film. That's cool. But then they ended up becoming stripped out. So that we ended up having like 10 hard facts. The facts that, again, Bob and I have worked on workplace safety, where we spent months doing, data crunching to have one headline in a World Report intro that says, across this country, 1 in 5 people die in workplace safety accidents. I seem to remember. I don't know if that's right, but that's what I remember. Just being able to say that kind of stuff, how hard it is. So we took those 10 strips of facts, and when you saw Josh Merchant and the little pieces of paper, the kids are writing, that was our journalism coming to life. So, yeah, I think it's definitely powerful. So, I mean, it's like, I don't know how many of these other examples of doing things in weird ways that I can show you to engage you in this idea that you too have to have conversations in your newsrooms, in your classrooms, to at least ask the question, who is the audience I'm trying to reach? Who needs to know this stuff? Or who might care? It's not enough for the journalist in the room to care about it. Somebody else has to be engaged. Somebody else has to care. So the question is really, who's the audience for this piece? And every time, it might be a different audience. And I think that's the one part of working in a large broadcaster like the CBC, is that there's an assumption made that people will come to you because you're big. And even now, even the New York Times has to do cool shit now to try and get people to come to them. Because it's not enough to just be big and to be legacy and to have history, which is all great. But what if nobody comes to you? What if nobody's listening? What if nobody cares? So it is important to ask that question for any story you're doing. Who is going to engage with me on this? Who should get this information? I mean, with the vets, you know, obviously there's a couple of levels going on. There's the level of the big legacy, large places. There's the directly interacting with vet communities. And so the key is, there isn't just one audience for your piece. I would argue there's many audiences, so how do you reach them? This is probably the weirdest thing we've done this year. So I will tell you that this is what it means to have a totally flat organization. So even though we have an editorial director and we have a managing editor and we have senior editors, you know, like myself, we also have a ton of people with talent. And unless you let them play, then you're actually breaking your own promise with your crew. So we have this guy, he is a absolute geek, okay? And his thing is interactives. He's a coder, he does all the data, he's a scraper, he is a super brilliant guy. His name is Mike Corey. And he came to me because I'm in charge of the video, audio, multi-platform stuff. And so he comes to me and says, hey, I want to make a video. I'm like, okay, what kind of video? He's like, we got this data, you know, it's all about the border and what gets seized at the border, and there's a hell of a lot of marijuana. I think we should do a story about it. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, how do you want to do that? And he says, I just think we need to show people, like, all that marijuana, like what it means. We've got to visualize it, which again is a term that everybody uses, like visualize the data, right? I'm sure you've heard that, Bob, visualize the data. So he's like, yeah, I've got this thing, and I have this meme I used to follow, and I think I am lost. I have no clue what he's talking about. So let me just show it to you, because it is definitely out there. But again, it actually did very well on the web.
In AD 2005 to 2011.
How are you, gentlemen? All your partner belong to us. Border Patrol imports seized 17 million marijuana pounds on the U.S.-Mexico border in 7 years. It is a lot of marijuanas. Now you will see what that looks like. Make your time.
All your days will days. All your days that belong to us. All your days will days. All your days that belong to us. All your days will days. All your days that belong to us. All your days will days. All your days that belong to us. All your days will days. All your days that belong to us. All your days will days.
So, you know, the first conversation we had about this piece, I will confess to you that one of my editors said, that's weird, we're not doing that. And I said, wait a second, I don't know this mem. Do any of you guys know about this like video from before? I mean, it's basically taking a concept and borrowing it. And so it, in one way, my question to him was, is this an inclusive project or an exclusive project? And in some respects, it's exclusive because a lot of people won't get it. Like at the beginning, you know, you're like, what the hell's going on? But I think over time, it actually engages on something that could be pretty dry. And so I think it's okay to have fun with the material. And so I think it did well because of the visualizations of the pot. And again, if you had said, you know, there's this many pounds of pot every year, blah, 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 I don't know. I don't know how much people would engage on it. But this one was an experiment, and we made this mainly in-house. And again, you know, if you are looking for help on how to do something that you don't know how to do, we do a lot of crowdsourcing of just people who want to like do stuff, and we get a lot of people who literally volunteer to say, oh yeah, I'll work on that with you. Sounds good. So we do that quite a bit, and I think that you can do that too. I want to make sure that I'm not missing the questions as I'm going, because I know I'm kind of challenging some of your assumptions.
I could ask one real quick question, and part of my question is just to tell everybody that we have a mic now that we can take around the room. But I'll take this moment just to sneak in a question. Do you get any pushback from people saying, you know what, this just is not journalistic values, it's not, I mean, I thought that was brilliant, but do you get pushback from people saying, you know, this is kind of going past objectivity and all those sort of values that we all talk about?
Well, you know what, I'm sure they do. So the best, it is the same bulletproofing technique of any other investigation. You better be right, right? So whether you're writing a lead piece for World Report or a documentary that airs on The Current, the assumption of those senior editors is that you are right about what you're saying. You have to be even more sure when you're doing something experimental that there is nothing that anybody can attack you on. So what we actually did with the pot piece is we wrote a nerd box, you know, here's our methodology, here's how we crunched our numbers. We did a whole, like we went to the statisticians at the UC Berkeley. I mean, we're lucky, right? We have this amazing university right next to us. But again, we made sure that we wrote it out, and so that every fact that you see up there, you know, and yes, it's got a little bit of a point of view, like that's shorter than the other thing or whatever, but it's the comparisons. How we did the math was we didn't just do it ourselves and check it internally, which, you know, you would be your standard. You would have to make sure that you can replicate your data and all that stuff. We went outside of house to make absolutely sure. And so we checked with some of the smartest, you know, statisticians at UC Berkeley. Here's how we did the math. Are you cool with this? So that if later somebody said, what's wrong with you people? We actually could say, well, everything in there is absolutely backed up, and here's our how we did it thing. And in fact, we got some coverage on this piece around different websites, and the way we wrote the nerd box was with a little bit of attitude. It's like, yeah, you know, math isn't really that interesting. We hear that a lot, but guess what? It actually is, because this is about joints. And I mean, we kind of pushed the envelope a bit, but every fact has to be bulletproof. You can't play around with the facts. You can play around with the form, if that answers your question. So anyway, when do we need to wrap? I just want to make sure I kind of get a. All right. One more question. Whoops.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for this. This is intriguing and inspiring. I'm wondering, though, this. 20 years ago, the New York Times, the World at 6, there were a lot of outlets that were really, the idea was it was for everybody. Totally comprehensive. Everybody will tune into this just because they do. In watching some of these, here's my question. Are you now suggesting that we all have to be seeing the audience? I like what you say about the audience. The audience is crucial. You have to think, who's the audience? How do I communicate the audience? Are you suggesting, though, that in most cases now, for most journalists, mainstream as well, we should be thinking in niches? we're going to create this niche, that niche? Is the idea of serving up one comprehensive show or a piece that can serve everybody, is that going out the way of the dodo?
I think the data would say yes. I think the fragmentation of the audience, I remember when we first started doing the research when I was still at CBC, of the audiences and the little pie, you know? Maybe you've seen some of the audience research where you see the pie. And it used to be the pie had, you know, like CBC, The National, and World Report, and maybe there would be some other stuff in there from some competitors like, you know, CTV. And the pie would be divided up by numbers, you know, how many millions are you getting, how many millions the other guy getting. The papers might look at circulation, they'd say, oh, the Globe is up, the Star is down, whatever, or whatever it was. But you know, that's stuff. Years ago, the pie started having little slices. Then it was like internet use. Then it was, you know, how many hours a day are people spending on the internet? The first numbers we got would be about the internet writ large, as though it was this big thing. But the internet is fragmented. So I think it's just the hard, cold reality of the fact that, and I'm not here to tell you what the latest numbers are and how many hours, but now it's about even click rates are going out the door. People are telling us, like, it's not about clicking anymore. It's about, time on site, right? How long are people coming to you? So the center is a very small piece of this larger media puzzle. So if we're going to get any attention, we have to get our stuff out to as many platforms as possible, which is why we're non-exclusive. So I think the first challenge is it actually a good thing to be exclusive? Which is what a lot of legacy media are. They don't like sharing. I mean, I remember how much people freaked out when I was at CBC saying, look, we got this great taser thing. We should work with CP and the Toronto Star and Radio Canada, right? They're like, why would we do that? And it's like, because every time our story gets out, you're going to have the branding. It's going to say CP, Toronto Star, CBC, or Radio Canada. Actually, it was Radio Canada, CP, and CBC. We did another thing with the Toronto Star. But every time that story comes out, there's going to be 3 brands everywhere we go. And think about it, I'd say to the CBC people. That CP story is going to every single newspaper in this country. How could that be a bad thing, right? So I do believe that we started that, and that was years ago when I was doing that. But yeah, the bosses thought that was weird. But I think you have to respond to what's going on around you, and it's fragmenting. So I think the only way is to get in front of different people, sometimes with the same story. So even though that story at the joints was definitely kind of counterculture, it ended up on a lot of websites that would be considered more traditional, because we also wrote that kind of attitude-y piece about the math, and we got a lot of coverage for it. So I think it's a tough answer, but you have no choice, is what I'm saying. I think you really should try, if you can. And there's really nobody stopping anybody from doing something. This is what it took me a lot of time at CBC to realize that it's okay to try. You don't always get what you want, but if you don't even ask, you're never going to get anything. So that was kind of my general trying to get stuff done at CBC was, if they're saying I don't have enough bodies in my team, I need more bodies, I have to find them. How do I do that? By teaming up. And now it's not just teaming up, it's also, can we explore the forum? And maybe if we team up and we experiment with forum, we might pick up more eyeballs. I don't know if that answers your question. It's probably a bit of a complicated response, but there's people way smarter than me who analyze this all day long. That's all they do, is figure out where's the audience, how's it fragmenting, what's the new layer that we have to deal with.
Hi, Susan.
Hi.
I'm brought here as the curmudgeon for this conference, so I have a slightly contrary view. I like it. Thank you for your presentation. I quite liked it, and your story about Corey, kind of validates a lot of what you're saying. I worry that we're making the culture dumber. I worry that we're saying we have to take our investigative journalism and we have to pretty it up and we have to give it to people in little packages that they can access, instead of saying to people, look, this is really fucking important. You got to figure out how to get into this stuff. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
Okay, do you have kids? Do you have kids?
No, God.
Okay. I guess I'll use an analogy. I have 2 kids. They're now older. My younger one is at Dal. The older one's 23 and working. How do you get a kid to eat spinach? It's good for them, but that doesn't mean they're going to eat it, right? So I'll give you an example. When my kids were young, like any mother, you're trying to get your kid to eat good stuff. And one of them was the broccoli. And the broccoli in our house ended up becoming ice cream cones because I let the kids pick it up and eat it like that. I just think that saying it's important, while I totally agree with you, it is so friggin' important. I've spent my entire career developing what matters to me as investigative journalism. And we've put a lot of energy and a lot of hours and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into that. And so I am entirely with you on the important part. What I've had to challenge myself to analyze over and over, because it doesn't end, is it enough to say it's important? And how do I persuade people to come with me? And all I'm arguing for is I am not against legacy, because trust me, we're on legacy media. Frontline is legacy, okay?
Right.
And so is the New York Times and all these places. I'm just saying, I would argue that you have to be in both places. So if you really want, I think if the Rape in the Fields investigation as an example, let's say, it's going to, we're going to enter it for a Peabody, right? It's an industry award that a lot of people will put their stuff in for and say, I am now going up against the best peers in the world, the BBC, and I'm going to bare my soul and put my work up for review by these incredible, 60 judges, and they deliberate, and it's a big deal. And I'm going to put my work there because I want to figure out, am I totally off base? Is my investigation, does it matter at all? So we use these benchmarks for ourselves, and I'm sure that if it ever did win anything, it would be because it was on Frontline. So I'm not saying that our investigation should go completely off into the YouTube universe, right? I'm saying you need to be in as many places as your organization can be. Some organizations are very narrow, and they're not going to be in a lot of places. But even, the CBC started putting stuff on YouTube, does social media. I don't know if it's very effective for them, but they're doing things because they have tried to reach at least more audiences. They're lucky because they get a large chunk of the broadcast audience, but it's diminishing. And so I guess I'm just being pragmatic, which is trying is okay. Being in one place for me is not okay anymore. That's where I'm coming from. So I'm going to skip over this. This is another example of kind of a little bit of an experiment. Do you guys ever read Yelp reviews? Yelp is another company out of the Bay Area, and they do the reviews. You go to a restaurant, you can go and read what people think. We did this massive border investigation. 2 of our reporters spent the entire year doing everything about the border, and by this they meant the southern border, which I often have to point out. I say there are other borders, but in America, the northern border, they don't talk about it unless I'm the one in the room saying, by the way, there's Canada up there. But anyway, the southern border is a massive story in the U.S. So our reporters spent the last year just doing all this, which is where the data came from about the marijuana seizures. And we also have been doing a lot of work on the Border Patrol. which is now the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. It is insane how much money the U.S. is spending on the Border Patrol. And they have all kinds of crazy problems. They have problems with abuse of force. They have problems with, suicide. They have like a shitload of problems. But what we found out in researching the Border Patrol is that people were crossing the border and getting scooped up by the Border Patrol and writing reviews about the border crossings and which ones were bad and what happened to them. And so it was like, the Border Patrol doesn't want to talk to us anymore. They hate our guts. I mean, they will not engage in any way with the Center for Investigative Reporting anymore because of all the work we've done. So, finding sources, people who cross the border where things happen to them, it's actually not that easy because it's a large number of people crossing that border you'd literally have to stake it out, and that would be pretty tough, So we go to Yelp and we find all these people who are writing reviews about their experiences. And some of what they were experiencing jived with our analysis of what, some of the things that were happening with the abuses and stuff, and arbitrary nature of the seizures and that kind of thing, and what they were doing to people. So we ended up going and tracking down these people like you would with any sources, verifying their stories, trying to get multiple sources, but a lot of them don't want to go like on the record, like not on camera or in video. So we dramatized it. We used actors to read out the voices, which, by the way, is another one of those things that a lot of media will not do. This whole idea of dramatizing, that is a line in the sand that I have, sometimes won, sometimes lost. And I think in this case, it's really just bringing to life the exact words of what these people published. So they've actually published something. So they have written these words themselves. What we had to do is verify, did it happen? And that was the hard part. But in terms of the words, here's what happens when you, when you review a border.
I know that there's a snowball's chance in hell that any of you will get arrested for trying to transport weed into Texas. For the record, we were driving through Texas on our way to Louisiana, and our California plates got us pulled over at the border. It also could have been because the drug dog started whimpering when he got next to our car. Anyways, long story short, we got arrested when they found weed in the car. Please note, a cannabis card will not save you in Texas. I repeat, a cannabis card will not save you when you're in Texas. Everyone we were locked up with were either illegal Mexicans or cannabis card carrying Cali natives. We met a lot of new buds in there. From Berkeley and San Ho and LA and SAC. They get 2 stars for being cool enough to lock me and my girlfriend up in the same cell, which we shared with 2 Mexican men and a little boy. But they only get 2 stars for telling us after the fact that we could have avoided jail time if we'd split the weed between us. We told them it was all hers, because she had the card. It was also cool of them to tell us that they openly pull over Cali plates because there's a good chance of finding weed in the car. But again, they told us this after the fact.
out of the... All right, look, I'm admitting it's sort of out there, right? But again, this was a long conversation. A lot of these things take a while to figure out, like how far will you go, you know? And the big discussion for us was, these guys who do these you know, bringing Yelp reviews and other things to life, these videos are like crazy popular. So again, if you're explaining to people where the information comes from, at the end of the day, you have to make the call, you know, would anybody else sort of understand what's going on? So we tried to bring it to life. But talking to your point about larger legacy media, and do you need to be in both places? And we do believe that you have to not just engage the various parts of the pie, but also try and innovate in spaces where there has traditionally been a vacuum. So in the US, the biggest news audience of all is public radio. It is huge. And it actually completely eclipses all the other media. Most journalists in the US don't even know that. Just like they don't know that World Report, you know, on the radio side of CBC has one of the biggest audiences in the country, and it, for some time, was way bigger, or still is, than the television side of the house. And so radio is a very powerful medium. So having spent, you know, much of my career in radio, when I came to the center, I said, what is going on? Why are we not on the radio? Like, what is wrong with us? And so it's taken a year of sort of strategic conversations with bosses and partners to get us to the point where we are actually developing and just launched a brand new radio show called Reveal. And so I'm the co-founder with a bunch of other people at the Center and PRX and the co-executive producer of Reveal. And that is about the most traditional audience you could go for, is the public radio audience. So this is a huge experiment that may completely fail down the road because we have to raise money to make this happen. But right now, our pilot that we produced this summer, we got on 120 stations in the US, which is a big deal. And so we are now trying to get our stories onto what is our own platform. So, you know, trying to figure out ways to not just have to turn into chameleons and sort of, you know, hook up with a Frontline or some other program and try and partner that way. We're also trying to see if we could provide the platform like this to a place that investigative journalism has a really tough time getting on the radio. Because much like the CBC, NPR is a gatekeeper of audience, and it's really tough to get your stuff on there because they have daily shows, they go on for hours, they deal with, you know, Syria and Libya and all the big things that happen in the world, and getting your story on, even if you work inside there, which I did, is very hard because you're competing with all the world's news every day, and Congress, which provides a lot of fodder for the newscast. And so we're trying to see what happens if you actually design your own platform. So it's experimenting with then allowing others to join you on that platform. So I'm, you know, hopefully maybe in a year I'll come back and say that we actually did this. We're doing 2 more pilots and then trying to raise money to go to a weekly sometime in 2015. You know, data visualization, I'm going to skip over this, but you know how important it is to get your data in front of people. So we published with Reveal. Our promise to the stations is that we aren't just going to give them the show, but that we will actually provide them digital assets to go with the story. So the first story we launched on Reveal had to do with the overprescription of opiates among vets. Everybody knew that vets take a lot of opiates because we heard that over and over through our reporting, but we spent 2 years trying to get the data to show what are the prescription rates of the 4 largest opiates, including Vicodin and Oxycontin and others. And it turned out that the rate had increased about 300% since the wars began, and that it was way off the chart, and the overdose rates amongst vets is double the national average. So it was definitely a big story. The other thing we're trying to do is figure out, in this world of fragmentation, how do you actually create a brand? And that's actually an interesting conversation that the question earlier raises, which is, if you are always partnering, how does anybody know who you are? And how do you get recognition so that more people know about you, so that more people might want your content and or partner with you? So we're establishing kind of our own sets of brands within that landscape. So Reveal is one of those experiments. And the other experiment is trying to take the idea of originals in a landscape of partnering. And so we've just done a branding exercise to try and figure out how to get more CIR into our stories. And so we've just
if the doctor's giving this to me, I'm going to take it, you know?
done this.
And if it makes you feel good, I'm going to take 15 of them.
U.S. Army Specialist Jeffrey Wagoner received a funeral with full military honors. He was medically evacuated out of...
So I'm just trying to be straight up with you that it's very challenging to be both a collaborator and an originator. And in a landscape where there's so much fragmentation, even a place like ours is trying to figure out how do you get people to kind of pay attention to your own brand, because otherwise we might get lost and nobody will remember who we are and might not partner with us. So what we've been trying to do is we will do our stories with some massive brands, but we're starting to insist on that CIR brand as well, and trying to figure that out is something that we're still in the middle of. I think one of the stories that you guys talked about in class was the shooter. I don't know, where's Fred? I think you guys, did you see the shooter video? So one of the reasons why I'll argue pretty strongly for an alternative treatment is that what I found working at the center and even before then at NPR is the most challenging aspects of investigative reporting is sources, getting sources to talk to you, getting sources to go on the record, protecting sources, and finding ways to still tell a story in a world where the risks to the sources are going up. Certainly in the US, if you watch what's been happening with the national security side of things, the leak investigations are going up. People are being really intimidated, including sources. So if you're going after journalists to try and get their sources, and you are going after the journalist, it sends a chill throughout the community of the sources that it's getting more dangerous. And certainly for any whistleblowers, the US environment is incredibly hostile. So we're dealing with this all the time. So my challenge to you is, how can you still tell the story? So in this past year, we experimented a lot with this idea of, can you still tell the story even when your sources won't go on tape, won't go, essentially want to remain anonymous. And what's your test? Obviously your test is everything has to be double and triple sourced. You need to have the documents. You need to do whatever you can to bulletproof your story. But the question is, will you still do the story if it matters? And what we try to do is say, yes, we have to do this story. And then the question becomes, how do you do the story? So as we wrap up here, the stories I want to show you are really an answer to that challenge. Different ways of bringing a story to life that you would not have been able to do any other way. So in case of the shooter, you've got a guy who is part of SEAL Team 6, who is entirely anonymous, and in fact, if you out him in any way, him and his family might actually, they would be facing severe harm. They might even end up dead. So we get this guy. It takes 18 months to woo him. He comes to one of our journalists, actually he's our board chair, Phil Bronstein, used to be a foreign correspondent, publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle, and now is working with us. So he gets this source that comes to him, and we start talking about, wow, this is a hell of a story. We have the guy who essentially shot Osama bin Laden, and he wants to talk to us. This is insane. This is a great story. Except for he says, I'm not. There's no way. You can't name me. I'm not going. He didn't even want to be on tape. Like I said to Phil, look, if we do a radio piece, we could get him on tape, we could alter the voice. And he's like, no. I'm not doing that because they'll figure out who I am, and. So we decide, all right, there has to be a way. Okay, first thing, print, because print, you can actually still do, even if you've not got tape or video. And so we teamed up with Esquire, which is a niche publication, because they wanted the big cover, and they gave us the cover because we said we won't give you the story unless we get the cover. And we made this happen very fast, very unusual. We wrote the story over Christmas, and it was published in February in Esquire. They have never done a cover that has been as big as this. So this was the most popular story that Esquire's ever done. And for us, it was huge because everybody talked about it. CNN then published a thing a couple of weeks later challenging it. But to this date, our guy's never been outed. And so we figure that's because nobody wants to challenge him because he is the guy who shot Osama bin Laden. So what we ended up doing is trying to figure out how do we now engage that other audience that we've been talking a lot about that's living in the world of media and YouTube and all those other places. And so we used a thing that we call graphic novel, which really is just illustrated video. And we essentially created a dramatization based on the shooter's story. And the only thing I had to work with was the transcripts. And so what we did is we took all these transcripts, like tons and tons of transcripts, because these interviews went on over many, many months. And we had to peel a narrative out of there. And the first draft was 40 pages. We had to peel more. And in the end, we ended up with a story that is the most popular video on our site. I won't play the whole thing.
The hardest part is kissing your kids goodbye, because you don't know if you're going to see them again. It's so much easier when they're asleep, because you can just get out and they don't say anything. But when they're awake, they cry, and you don't know if that's the last thing you're going to see. That usually lasts for about 5 minutes in the car on the way to the command, and then it just clicks, and you're ready to go. My first deployment with SEAL Team 6 was Afghanistan. My second was Iraq, and Afghanistan, Iraq again. I just realized how small the world is. I can imagine being over here and watching the wars, and you think that's so far away it doesn't even matter. Like people are detached from it. But you're a few hours away on the plane. It's just weird to be there for the first time. This is the place I've been hearing about on the news. The place is dangerous. It's a bad spot. We would work at night so that our day starts when the sun is going down. One night you'd go and it'd be literally an empty house. And the next night, there would be 13 fighters inside. You never knew what you were going to get until you got there. We came up with a tactic to be quiet. Instead of blowing the door open, we'd pick locks or sneak in so we would literally wake people up, Al-Qaeda. If we only killed 5 or 6 guys a night, we were wasting our time. We could have gone somewhere else, and that's a lot of dudes to be killing. We'd go in and the guy would be sleeping, up against the wall where his cologne, deodorant, soap, suicide vest, AK-47 and grenades, it's like he'd be sleeping right there. We had a target like that in Iraq. They started waking up and shooting at us. We ended up clearing about 7 or 8 houses, and we killed an entire cell of Al-Qaeda, probably 14 guys. No women were hurt, no children were hurt, but they were there. We were working with 2 dogs at the time. The dogs would sniff them out. The woman's quote in the newspaper was, "Ninjas came with lions." The reason we knew this was a special mission is because we just finished an Afghanistan deployment and were on a training trip diving in Miami when a few of us got recalled to the command in Virginia Beach. There was so much going on. The Libya thing, the Arab Spring. We knew something good was going to go down. We didn't know how good. The first day's briefing, they actually kind of lied to us, being very vague. They said it was a compound somewhere. We were going to have 2 aircraft get us there, and we don't know how many are inside, but we have to get something out. Literally, that was it. Then they said, we're leaving on Sunday morning, and we're going to drive down to Harvey Point, North Carolina, to get briefed again and start training. The Master Chief was saying Joint Special Operations Command would be there. The Secretary of Defense might be there. The PAC Afghan CIA desk too. That's when the wheels started spinning for me. This is big. Sunday, 3 of us were driving. One of my guys says, "I bet it's Bin Laden." The guy sitting next to me snapped his fingers and was like, "That's exactly what I've been thinking all weekend." Then the driver goes, "Man, if it's Osama Bin Laden, dude, I'll suck your dick." So after I shoot UBO, I bring him over to see his body. Okay, now is as good a time as any. We were in a classroom and they actually had security sitting outside. No one else was allowed in. The SEAL commander, cool as ever, said, "Okay, we're as close as we've ever been to UBO." There was none of that cheering bullshit. We were thinking, yeah, okay, good. It's about time that we killed this motherfucker. They had to explain what the place looked like, how they found it, how they were watching it. There was one guy who was taller than anyone else that would walk around the yard. They called him the Pacer, and they didn't see him anywhere else except there. You could tell the CIA analyst was excited. She wanted to say, "We got him. This is my life's work. I'm positive." But she leans towards 80%. 80% that the guy's going to be there. They had a mock-up there. We started training on that. They brought up helicopters. They had a planning table, the model of the place, and we just stand around and look at it. And then we started coming up with ideas. We had a lot of time planning this one. We're used to going on the fly. Here's your target, we're leaving in 20 minutes, come up with a plan. This compound was pretty easy. I was usually the guy to joke around when we were planning these things. We'd all dick around a lot. But I was like, hey guys, we have to take this fucking serious. There's a 90% chance this is a one-way mission. We're gonna die, so let's do this right. When we got to Nevada a few days later, we still didn't know what kind of aircraft we were using. We turned the corner, saw the helos we'd actually use, and I started laughing. Told the guys, the odds just changed. There's a 90% chance we'll survive. They asked why, and I said, I didn't know they were sending us to war on a fucking Decepticon. The day before we launched, it was dark out still. We were at our camp in Jalalabad, and the CIA woman was pacing. She asked me why I was so calm. I told her, we do this every night. We go to a house, we fuck with some people, and we leave. This is just a longer flight. And I was like, I understand why you should be stressed, because you have to be right. We're just going. She looked at me and said, 100% he's on the 3rd floor, so get there if you can. Before we left on the buses to the helicopter, I made all my phone calls in my gear. Called my father. I found out later he was in a Walmart parking lot. I said, hey, it's time to go to work. Like, goodbye, nice knowing you. I thought there was a good chance of dying. He knew something significant was up, though he didn't know what. We started to tear up. He told me later that he sat in his pickup in that parking lot for an hour and couldn't get out of the car. We had to fly an hour and a half in and then an hour and a half out. We wanted to be in and out in the darkness. Every 15 minutes they'd tell us we hadn't been painted. meaning no radars hit us. I remember banking to the south, which meant we were getting ready to hit. My biggest concern was having to piss really bad and then having to get off in a fight needing to pee. I used one of my water bottles. I peed in that, and I actually carried it through the whole mission. I forgot until later when I shot bin Laden in the face, I had a bottle of piss in my pocket. We opened the doors and I looked out. The area looked different than where we trained, because we're in Pakistan now. There are the lights, the city, there's a golf course. This is some serious Navy SEAL shit we're gonna do. This is so badass. The first helo had a hard landing. The nose hit the sand and then the tail stayed on the fence and it just stopped. They just jumped out and went to work. I was carrying a big-ass sledgehammer to blow through a wall if we had to. There was a gate on the northeast corner and we went right to that. We put a breaching charge on it, clacked it, and the door peeled like a tin can. But it was a fake gate with a wall behind it, like a Bugs Bunny house. They thought we'd waste our time on that, so they'd have time to prepare. But that was good. We knew someone was defending themselves. There was something good here. We were about to blow the next door on the north end when one of the guys from the bird that crashed came around the other side and opened it. We'd always assumed we'd be surrounded at some point. You see the videos of him walking around and he's got all those jihadis, but they weren't prepared. They got all complacent. The guys that could shoot shot, but we were on top of them so fast. One of the SEALs shot a guy and a woman. He told me, Jesus, these women are jumping in front of these guys. They're trying to martyr themselves. Another sign that this is a serious place. There's a hallway, there's a room here, there's a room here. The dead guy and the dead woman were right there on top of each other. You keep going further, there's 2 more rooms. And then there's the fucking door. That's the one we were just beating the piss out of, putting bombs off. I was holding down watching them breach it. And I saw a girl about 5 crying in the corner. I went, picked her up, and brought her to another woman. There had to be 15 people downstairs, all sleeping together in that one room. The breacher had to blast the door twice for it to open. We started rolling up. I was about 5 guys back on the stairway when I saw the point man holding up. He'd seen Khalid, bin Laden's son. I heard him whisper, Khalid, come here, in Arabic, then in Pashto. That confused Khalid. He leaned out, armed with an AK, and he got blasted. He was dead on the stairs. We just stepped right over him and kept going. He was the last line of security. The point man moved past doors on the 2nd floor, and 4 of the 5 guys in front of me started to peel off to clear those rooms, which is always how the floor works. We're just clearing as we go, watching our backs. He's still the point man, and I move up to number 2. I turn around and look. There's nobody else coming up. The point man, at that time, saw bin Laden on the 3rd floor peeking around a curtain. The point man took a shot, maybe 2, and bin Laden disappeared back into a room. There were 2 chicks yelling at us, and the point man was yelling at them, and he said to me, hey, we need to get moving. By then, we realized we weren't getting more guys. We had to move, because bin Laden is now going to be grabbing some weapon because he's getting shot at. I had my hand on the point man's shoulder and squeezed, a signal to go. The 2 of us went up. On the 3rd floor, he tackled the 2 women in the hallway right outside the first door on the right, moving them past it just enough. He thought he was going to absorb the blast of a suicide vest. He was going to kill himself so I could get the shot. I rolled past him into the room. There was bin Laden standing there. He had his hands on a woman's shoulders, pushing her ahead in the direction of the hallway commotion. It was his youngest wife, Amal. He can hear, but he can't see. It was a snapshot of a target ID. Definitely him. Even in our kill houses where we train, there are targets with his face on it. I thought in that first instant how skinny he was, how tall, how short his beard was, all at once. I don't know if she's got a vest and she's being pushed to martyr them both. He's got a gun within reach. He's a threat. In that second, I shot him 2 times in the forehead. He crumpled on the floor in front of his bed and I hit him again. He was dead. I remember as I watched him breathe out that last part of air, I thought, is this the best thing I've ever done? Or the worst thing I've ever done? This is real, and that's him. Holy shit. Back at the Jalalabad base, we pulled bin Laden out of the back.
I'm going to stop it there because it's kind of heavy. Anyway, there it is. Yeah.
So, my question about this is it's extremely captivating. And it's interesting to hear
It's extremely captivating, and it's interesting to hear the first-person narrative of a soldier talking the way that he would talk. You definitely hear that voice, and the images draw you into the story. But my fear is that in some way, this reminds me of the very problematic U.S. recruitment tactics used by, creating video games that get young men interested in war, by creating films that glorify war and that idea of being kind of like the lone soldier going out there and doing something heroic and so on. And as I listen to this, those alarm bells are going off in my mind, and I'm saying, is it enough just to tell the story? Is it enough to get people interested in the story? Where are the spaces of analysis and criticism and problematization, or are we falling into potentially inadvertently championing this kind of like chauvinistic soldier macho culture?
I mean, look, that's actually, there is another section of this video now that is going into the long-form piece, talked really about how is it possible that these guys, and SEAL Team 6 is just one elite unit of a military that has been going into the field mission after mission after mission. This has never happened in U.S. military history, where that you have this repeated use of special forces in this way. And what our piece was very brutal in arguing is that these guys are, you're essentially taking a body, you're training it, spending millions of dollars, and then you're wrecking that person. And when they come back, they can't even talk about who they are, and they can't get services and all of these things. So the piece looked at what is the military doing. It was another veterans piece, to be honest, because when it comes to special forces, they're actually a group of people that is having real trouble, readjusting, because they do weird shit. They are being paid to kill somebody every day. I mean, a soldier is paid to kill. But if you're a special forces guy, you're an assassin, is what you are. So these questions are very legitimate. How do you deal with something this tough? In the second part of the video, we actually have him coming back and talking about what it felt like to be back. To your other question is in terms of how is this sourced? It was a really complicated piece. So yes, you're hearing the point of view of the soldier, and it is his point of view, but in terms of the other sources to verify say even like some of the imagery that we used, the girl in the corner, what is she wearing, what does the compound look like, every last bit of this was sourced. So you could argue, telling the story of this mission, is it problematic because it glorifies soldiers? The fact of the matter is the entire world got wrapped up in hunting Osama bin Laden. We're all tied up in it too. If you're a Canadian citizen, our guys have been over there. So I think it's one of those unavoidable things. I feel as a journalist, if I've got the guy who was there, then I'm getting about as close to the action as I can get. I'd rather hear his story than 15 others that are 10 layers out. But it's definitely a question, how do we play into that glorification of war? But I guess, we've been at war now since 9/11 as essentially a country of the U.S. All the allies, all of NATO was trying to hunt this guy. So this was a world level story. And so all I tried to do by making the video is actually put the true voice of the guy back in there. Because some of the details that he's talking about later when he talks about his kids, how he prepared his wife for potential attack, hide in the bathtub, do this. I think I was just trying to get into the voice of the soldier as closely as possible. It was some kind of veracity, like the bottle of piss. That was an editorial discussion. Do we want to put that in? So there are a lot of questions about the detail, And the choices we made of the detail we left in, I think, say as much about the human aspects of that day for these soldiers, of being essentially a mission they didn't think they'd return from. So it's like a radio story with pictures. If we had this kind of audio, I think Steve would say, "Are you nuts? Of course we're going to use it," right? I mean, it's the truest form of storytelling, and I think in all of the various debates about do you or don't you report on war and the after effects of war, as an organization, we're committed to reporting not just the drama of the shooter, but the vets as a whole. We've spent 2 years doing that. So I think if we're going to be judged, we should be judged on the overall coverage. But it's a totally valid question. Does this depiction of the soldiers' role in this killing glorify it or not? My argument is it happened, we're documenting it, and it was a killing mission. So I think we're going to wrap. So if there's questions,
May I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, let's talk about the questions. I'm going to stop showing stuff.
Five-word answer.
Yeah.
The question being, I think you said that your center has 75 staff. How many are investigative journalists and how many are designers and animators of various stripes?
In fact, all of our, I would say, apart from our engagement staff, which is 5, the majority of the people there are investigative journalists who have come out of investigative newsrooms and who have developed certain skills. So in fact, the guy who voiced this is one of our data analysts, and he has, again, going from some of the source material, I was sitting in a meeting and I had my back to Augie, the guy, and I heard him talk and I went, oh my God, that's the shooter. So sitting right in our newsroom, we had a guy that was very, there was a lot of similarities in the tone of his voice. So we have a data team that is top-notch, led by Jennifer LaFleur, who you probably have trained with at IRE. So the entire data team are investigative journalists. Our video and multimedia producers have also spent time in that world, but this is kind of their expression of it. We have a couple of filmmakers who are younger, who came through film school. They're probably the least experienced when it comes to the investigative work, but they have now been in that environment, so they're now the ones asking the question of how do I source this, and we're trying to make sure that they are asking those kind of questions. But I would say the large majority of the people working there have experience with investigative reporting. We have 26 reporters. Some of these reporters have never worked in a traditional newsroom, and they essentially came out of IRE training, and we picked them up because they're good at digging stuff up. So we're very fortunate in that way. It's become a bit of a magnet. So whether it's CIR or there's other organizations like this in the US that you might be familiar with, ProPublica is one, they're New York based, all investigative reporters. And all of our editors, Rosie, who's my boss, who you saw earlier, Robert Rosenthal, former publisher of the Philadelphia Times, Pulitzer Prize winner, foreign correspondent, etc. Very experienced people that are there because they have answered the question that you asked at the beginning. Does it still matter? Yes, it does. Investigative journalism is all that we're about. It's one of the most mind-blowing experiences to walk up and down the stairs of this very crowded space we're in, and you hear, a reporter talking to another reporter like, I'm not getting my FOIAs back. And, everybody there is talking about the stuff that is the essence of investigative reporting. Getting the material, finding the sources, crunching the data. That's all over the place. My job is to try and help the reporters tell the stories in as many ways as they possibly can, and getting them excited about not just the digging, which they spend years down the rabbit hole, coming out of the rabbit hole and saying, now you actually have to tell a story that somebody's going to care about. And so I'm just trying different things and different ways to get their story in front of people.
Suzanne, in terms of the shooter, I'm curious because I know you, and I know for a fact that that's true. Just because I trust you implicitly, because I know how psychotic you are about checking facts and making sure you don't get it wrong, and from working with you for so long. But for others who don't know you, and we have a situation right now in Nova Scotia. There's been a horrific death in a small town. A homeless guy, only one person only homeless good person in the town. Largely known that it seems like two kids set him on fire and killed him. Police haven't said that. No one said it out loud. No one's confirmed it. But certain medias are now saying that, even though it hasn't been confirmed. They have no substantiation whatsoever of it, but they're saying it. Do not pieces like this add to the problem much of the public has with the media saying, you know what, they really haven't shown me anything. What they've shown me is a cartoon with some guy talking. I know it's true, but people here don't. And
Are you
how do you
talking
get
about the
around
voice
that?
actor?
Huh?
You mean using a voice actor?
Just proving it, substantiating that
Right.
you really have the guy.
Right.
I mean, how do you do that? I mean, and I'm sure every other media just said, shit, I wish I had it, but at the same time, they didn't prove it.
Okay, so with any investigative story that's source-based, I would say, one of the reasons why, colleague of ours, David Mackay, was a computer-assisted champion, still is, loves data, is because it's not anecdotal. It's the many numbers tell us that this happens many times, and there's sort of safety in that, right? We love it when we have trends, and then we go find the people to illustrate those trends. A source-based story is the exact polar opposite of that. It's you having to work with a source and then verifying in many ways, is this person telling the truth? How do we, And so I would say any source-based story is where, that's where, people like me, editors, have sleepless nights, because you have to go through the verification process. And so in the case of the shooter, you have an 18-month process of interview after interview after interview that was conducted, and there are records of these interviews. It's kind of tricky because they're records, but at the same time, we've had to be cautious about those records, right? And where they are and stuff. But they are there. And so what do? You do what you do in any source-based investigation. You find other sources to try and help you flesh out that narrative. So you need to get other people who, can you find people who know the shooter? And it might sound hard, but yes. Is that difficult? Yes. But can you do it? Yes. Can you find people, if you know what to do inside the CIA, who knew about the mission? Yes. Do you have to go through every transcript and look at, did he say this the same way 10 times? Has he changed the facts? All that stuff that you do in an investigative context, whether you're an investigative reporter or another kind of investigator, whether you're doing fraud or you're a cop, you have to go over that stuff and check things as best you can. At the end of the day, I will say honestly, whenever you do source-based reporting, you face risks of, how much of the truth can you tell? Because truth, everybody talks about truth. We have to find the truth. But if you've done it for a while, you know that there's many truths. Everybody's going to tell that story a slightly different way. I remember Cecil Rosner used to do training at CBC where he would take an incident, I think it was a fire in Winnipeg or something. Certain things happened, and the headline the next day basically got the story wrong because one reporter talked to one person who said this thing happened, and then they went back and checked, and it actually was completely the opposite. So I really think you've hit the nail on the head. Source-based reporting is the hardest type of investigative reporting because you have to get as many sources as you can to bulletproof that story. And I would be really dishonest if I didn't sit here in front of a bunch of investigative reporters and say, before we published this piece, I was freaking out, you know? Because you're just always going, did I do it? Did I check everything? Did I do this, that? I mean, you're, eventually you decide to publish. And you do the best work that you can, and you make a decision, and you publish, and we published. And yes, we believe this is the guy who killed Osama bin Laden. And even though there are people who will dispute that, and that often happens in your investigative reporting. I mean, I remember the vote rigging scandal in Manitoba. The Elections Commission said that it wasn't rigged, and they'd done a thorough investigation. So 5 years later, we do the investigative reporting. We find out they never even went to any of the witnesses, right? So it's not an easy thing. I'm not going to stand in front of you and say, oh yeah, easy peasy, no big deal. It's a huge deal to publish a piece like this. And thanks for asking that question, because yeah, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night. I mean, telling the story in cool ways, that's the fun part. The hard part is I also have to do, which is like figuring out, you know, with the other editors, whether we can publish it. Thank you very much.
Well, wasn't that incredible? I mean, my eyes were just open today. I mean, I learned 10 new things. I'm sure everybody did. And what I was most impressed with, the kind of the blow me away wow quality, is just this sense of finding new ways of, once you've got all that stuff, you've got the sources, the documents, but you got to find ways to engage the audience. And wow, that was amazing. And thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
For those of you who are looking for lunch, a few steps away, Prince Hall is open, and I say around $8. And the Twitter team, we're going upstairs to the journalism school very soon. And everybody else, we're back here at 1:15. And Tim is going to talk about his amazing story on former Mayor Peter Kelly. And I mean, that story was amazing in so many ways, not only because of the incredible work with documents and sources, sometimes private documents, not just the public ones you can always get, but you know, documents that aren't so easy to get, but also because of the impact it had. Mayor Kelly, after that story ran, chose not to run again, and we have a new mayor in Halifax, and I think that story had a good part to do with that decision. So I'm really excited about that. So 1:15 back here, and for those of you on the live stream, we'll be back on the air at that time. Thanks so much.